Good morning. We're really happy to see all of you here. You survived. You survived and you're here on the last day. Well, welcome everybody to the final plenary for SPHR17. My name is Archana Pandya. I'm with, I run this initiative called OpenGlobalRights. And so right off the bat, I'm going to say this plenary is a bit of an experiment. So we want it to be a space for reflection of what we've discussed, what we've talked about, not talked about, and what we're taking away from the last 3 days of really engaging and interesting conversations. But before I start, I wanted to give you my little spiel about Open Global Rights. So as you guys have heard Yusuf say many times, we've partnered this year for the first time with SPHR. Open Global Rights is a multilingual online platform for critical discussions on human rights policy strategy, basically a space for people who are interested, involved in researching, doing activism, to come, reflect, think critically about how we're doing things, how we're not doing things, and maybe think about how we can do them a little bit better. And so we launched 4 years ago as a section of Open Democracy, and our basic modus operandi is to publish short op-ed style articles by as diverse diverse a group of people as possible from the global human rights community. And so our pieces are about 1,000 words, and they are multilingual. We accept in any language, and we publish in many, including, how many are we now? 25 now. And so every few months we launch a new series to start a conversation around big issues, most recently climate change. As some of you may know, this week is COP23, and so in the lead up to that, we started a series of critical pieces around how human rights is and isn't part of that conversation, and how we can bring it into advocacy that's being done around these negotiations. So we launched these series as a starting point for dialogue, and they stay open. They're big, broad themes, and we try to bring in as diverse perspectives as possible in terms of the authors. We work very hard to bring in Global South and women in terms of our contributors, and about 80% of our authors are not actually writers. So our approach to writing is one where we want to work with people who are doing human rights to write about it so that we can learn from their experiences. So since we launched in 2013, we've published over 1,500 articles in 25 languages. We've been read by well over around 2.5 million people in over 140 countries. We've launched 20 series, a wide range of topics. So I encourage you to come and explore and contribute and use the space as your own. That is exactly what we are trying to make it, a space for critical reflection for the human rights community. That is enough about Open Global Rights. So as I mentioned when we just a few moments ago, this session is to be a one of reflection and thinking around what we're taking away, but what we've learned, what we haven't, what we've shared, and what we're taking away. And so to kick off, I've asked Jackie, Shayna, and Fateh, and of course Joel was with me here, to be my guinea pigs and start the dialogue. This is going to be a dialogue where we want everybody to participate. So here we want them to start the conversation, but we want everyone to feel free to partake and raise their hands and join at any time. And so to begin the conversation, I'd like to ask our panelists to take a kind of a brief moment to introduce themselves, but then talk about some of the overlapping and common themes that they have felt have come out from the conversations this week. So what have we heard multiple times? What have we been surprised about? And what have we learned from the various bigger plenaries as well as the smaller sessions? So I'll hand it over to whoever would like to start first.
You taking the...
I'll just throw out a few ideas.
Who are you?
I'm Jackie Smith. I teach sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, and I am a co-coordinator of the Pittsburgh Human Rights City Alliance. And some themes that emerged for me or that I've been thinking about as we've been going on these few days. I think the theme of borders and national borders has emerged in a few places, and it raises, I think, important questions that we probably could grapple with a little further, and maybe this is a good space for that. How do borders affect our thinking about human rights? How do they affect the possibilities for realizing human rights? And is this a political moment where we're being challenged collectively with this notion of national boundaries and national containers for human identities? And is this an opportunity to really push forward some new thinking about human rights and their universality? So I've been thinking about that through the week. And another idea that emerged from the opening panel, and our compañero from Spain made a parallel or referenced liberation theology and the form of organizing that took, and it really resonated for me in thinking about how should we be organizing our human rights struggles, and just so I hadn't put these together, but thinking about the preferential option for the poor, and the organizational structure of base communities that create a foundation for a movement, and the real need for local empowerment and emancipation as part of a collective emancipation. And so maybe we can think some about, are there lessons from struggles in the past and struggles that continue in Latin America that we might take to a broader human rights movement and really maybe be more self-conscious about our work as a human rights movement.
Hi, my name is Shana Plout, and I wear many hats, as I'm sure many of us do. I'm the research manager for the Global Reporting Center, and then I also teach courses on human rights and social justice at the University of Winnipeg and the University of Manitoba. In terms of summarizing, and I'm also the human rights editor for Praxis Center, which I'm going to plug at the end, so just be aware. In terms of summarizing some of the main themes that I've heard, and surprising in a good way, surprising in that way that makes your brain tingle and gets you happy. One is, as always, the praxis focus of this conference. And truly the praxis focus in terms of activism informing academia, academia informing activism. And at this point, the fact that this is the third iteration of the conference, you can actually see the conversations and the collaborations, how they've grown. And that's something that I find really inspiring. And it's the reason why I know I particularly come back, because it's actually unfortunately unusual. But also the respect that's given that activists and academia and academics may be the same person, and that's actually a good thing. And so that's a space for this. So that's number one. Thematically, one of the things that I saw that was interesting was, and it was actually fairly new in this time, is problematizing the notion of a pure victim. And the fact that victims are actually experts and informers and activists. So not just having this victim category as victim as somebody with whom we should feel sorry for, or somebody with whom we should see as a hero, or et cetera, but actually this multidimensional, multifaceted notion of victim, survivor, expert, informer, critic, et cetera. And that's a really respectful place without a fetishized place that I think is really important. For once, in a conference on human rights, I actually heard clear conversations about class. And class in the United States, not just classes over there. And that's really important. And then lastly, this came up just a little bit in the last session that I was in, but something that I kind of heard bubbling around was empathy as a strategy, as actually a human rights strategy, but also how that can be very problematic. That we need to be careful But using empathy as a strategy for what purpose? Using empathy as a strategy for what aim, for what goal? Understanding that that may be a genie out of the bottle, but could also be a really powerful alchemy.
Right. Thank you. I decided to do it a little bit differently instead of, myself issuing some kind of fatwa about what I felt was was an interesting or emerging themes of that. I just actually went back to the program and did my own quick little survey of the issues and topics that you, the researchers and the writers and the academics and the practitioners have chosen. And, some interesting thoughts emerge. I mean, it was a huge number of topics that were covered in this conference, right? And forgive me, that's not an exact science, of course, this is kind of, but it gives you an idea at least. There were at least 15 papers that had to do with refugees, migrants, and migration. There were 9 researches and approaches that dealt with religion, faith-based sources for rights work, faith-based approaches to rights work, etc. 8 on gender, on women, and 5 more on LGBTQ issues and that arena of work. 7 on transitional justice, not only in the particular session on TJ, but there were 7 on transitional justice. Quite a few, another 7 on climate change and environmental and climate change issues. 6 of them on trafficking, on modern forms of slavery, on that arena of research. 4 on race and equality, on development, on inclusive development and sustainable development, and another 4 on economic justice in broader terms, plus 11 other topics beyond those that I just mentioned. That's a huge research agenda that people have. And I would add to that 16 geographically focused kind of research. They could be in any one of the themes that we were just talking about, but there were 16 areas of the world that were of interest in the research papers that were presented and projects discussed here. This is only a smattering of the kinds of issues and interests that a human rights lens can give us in how we look at issues that can also be looked at from a sociological perspective, from a political perspective, from an international relations perspective, etc., or a strictly legal perspective. And that leads me to just mention something that came up in the previous session just now, is to what degree, in fact, that human rights straddles the moral, the legal, and the political spheres. Now, whether we look at it in terms of borders, as we're saying, and whether we look at it in terms of, sociological, political organization of etc., it is actually all 3 of these spheres intersect and interact with one another in the human rights field. And that makes for a very interesting research agenda. And I very much go along with Shayna, and I had it here as one of my first points to mention here, is the academic and practitioner nexus, and how important that is, and how research has to inform activism, and how the activist can be the researcher, can inform the academic, to try and reduce that, the obsession that's, I must say, and please forgive me and I apologize in advance, the obsession that so many academics have in creating theories and frameworks that often are just divorced really from reality. They could be interesting, they could be fascinating read, and I recall, remember what came out a few years ago, sorry prof, but nobody's reading you, about how many researches that are never actually read by others than those who are, checking for your tenure application or whatever. So I just wanted to bring that out and refocus that as well. And 2 other thoughts very quickly. One is, I don't think we need to frame a research agenda. I think each of us have their own research agenda. And I think there is room for everybody in this field of knowledge building and understanding on this nexus between the moral, legal, and political lives that we have that are represented in the human rights. But it would be really interesting to focus on identifying novel approaches, interesting new, not only ideas in terms of themes, but ideas in terms of how we do the research, how we do bring the practitioner and the researcher and the academic together, how we do bring the student and the migrant and the indigenous person. See, I did it.
Finally.
And really, how we do bring them together in order to have impact, in order to create a change. Not for the hell of it, but the purpose has to be to create positive change. That's really all of it.
Thank you. I'll just say a couple things, and some of them are related to Jackie's point. In thinking about the way we articulated the themes of the conference as particularly urgent, and as much as they challenge the way we think about globalization, global flows, global organization, et cetera. So much of it, of course, has been advanced by nationalism and by nativism and by an increased emphasis on provincialism and being local. And we see that generally as sort of, not to speak for everyone, but as sort of people with a cosmopolitan sensibility. We think that nationalism or nativism or locality or proximity can be sort of a dirty word. Right, but at the same time, what I keep thinking about is how much more the local matters in that way, and I don't know, and that part of that is just the way I personally, but my sense is I've heard it from others too, is the way I'm reacting to urgent threats that are local, and in many cases these kinds of threats are not new. Maybe they feel more urgent, maybe they're louder, maybe they're perhaps more imminent, but if you probably sat in a different seat than I normally sit, a lot of these threats are not particularly new. If you already had a vulnerable status or you were already marginalized in any other kind of way, these threats are probably not new. And so I think it's an expression of from where I sit that it is all the more urgent to respond to the kinds of threats that are louder and more imminent as close as they are to me and where I am. And so just like the Human Rights Cities initiatives, like why is it important to declare, in your local place that you subscribe to these norms, and just the very fact of being active and being involved in your place is, I don't know, I guess thinking about that, I don't know how to connect it then to these, broader global norms or institutions or organizations. So I just wonder how at this moment, a lot of the things that we've taken for granted in a certain sense about globalization and global governance, et cetera, are being challenged both by sort of threats to human rights, but also maybe as responses from human rights defenders. So let's open it up for a few minutes because I want to hear from you all as well in terms of sort of some themes, things that surprise you, things that you learned. We'll have microphones coming around. But what else did you hear a lot about or repeatedly, or things that you're really sort of leaving with aha moments, so to speak?
Well, taking the themes and stuff from maybe a slightly different direction, one of the things that I really appreciated was that there were areas where people can really focus on what they think about their work as an activist, whether it's a professional or as a kind of something adjacent to their professional lives, that there was a lot that was about people's research and how to expand it given the information and other people's approaches. And then there was also a lot about those of us who happen to be university professors or teachers in some way about how to work this into what we teach. So as I was reflecting, last night about my experience the last couple of days was that, okay, there's things that I hadn't thought about being an activist on that I want to get involved with now. Oh, there's things that there are new avenues to open up in my research. And there are definitely things that I'm going to change about how I'm teaching my classes. And I think that, one of the great things about the mix of people that come to this conference. It's interdisciplinary. We've got practitioners, we've got academics, and we've got students, and so we're all talking to each other as experts in something narrow, but yet needing to understand that our audience isn't that narrow field. And so I think that allows us to be kind of our better selves, if you will, because no one's trying to be the smartest guy in the room. And I really, really appreciate that.
Other reflections, themes that you saw? Theo?
Having attended all of the SPHR17 conferences, I remember the first one, certainly maybe the second one, some of the sessions like this at the end. Some people would remark that we need more focus on human rights issues domestically. And I think this conference has, for sometimes reasons that we would rather not be, has done that big time. Okay? Whether the balance is the correct one or not, I'll leave that to other people. But that's just an observation. And I think it's very appropriate that we do talk about things, whether it be the perpetuation of racial inequities through institutional means, policies with respect to immigration, border issues, and so forth.
But to shamelessly poach the microphone here. And this is very similar to what I was going to say about U.S. exceptionalism was a theme I saw across the meeting. How to gradually kind of deconstruct that exceptionalism in various ways and reconstruct a commitment to human rights in the vernacular, wherever we happen to be in our locality. So it's simultaneously a very exciting thing to be digging into and talking about, but lots of dilemmas, lots of conundrums, lots of how to begin with some of these very powerful ideologies that we're combating in terms of U.S. exceptionalism. And I'm Miranda Alan, and this is Theo Micah. We're both from the University of Dayton.
I'd really like to say something to that.
Yeah. Let's go to Teresa.
Thanks. I'm Teresa Harris with AAAS. One of the themes that really came out across the sessions I attended was the important role of, different words were used, facts, empirical evidence, rigor, and at the same time, that's not enough. You have to have narrative. You have to have, again, different words used, heart and morals, and how to combine those together into a powerful message for change. And interestingly, that reflects behavioral psychology research in public health about what motivates people to take a change in their lives or to what motivates social change, is that you have to have both of those. You have to have facts and you have to have emotional drive at the same time. And that's something that I think there's a lot of room for more exploration and thinking about how do we balance those and maybe adapt that to different situations.
Thank you.
No, and just adding directly to that, there also has to end. So we say all the time in our advocacy and our research and our work, you have to hit people in the heart and in the head. Got a lot of that. That's sort of a simplification of, I don't know if Matt's in the room, some stuff we got from Matt Crane in the past on framing of advocacy. But then it has to end with, we say head, heart, and hands. There has to be a call to action. You have to give people, have the recommendations, have the clear call for the students and for everybody else and everything, what to do. Because you get people fired up. It does no good at all we talked about this in the beginning of the session, how so many times with human rights, we talk about all the wrongs, all the abuses, and we don't talk about all the positives. And you can't just make people depressed if you're trying to broaden the audience and then pat them on the back and go home. You can't do that to your students, I think, or your partners. You have to really bring them to a place where they feel galvanized to take action. And I'm seeing that around this conference. People are wanting to get involved. We've had so many great suggestions and recommendations on what to do, a policy agenda, a clear means of political activism, education, et cetera. I think that's really important to hold on to.
a couple thoughts up here.
Go ahead.
I actually really wanted to, and I'm kind of moving us to the second thing. I really wanted to talk a little bit about U.S.-centric and U.S. exceptionalism and the U.S., right? So as some of y'all may know, I mean, I come from a bit of a unique perspective of being born and raised in the U.S. and then having emigrated to Canada 8 years ago. I like to joke around that my people have survived millennia because we make contingency plans and we have multiple passports. And this is how we keep surviving. That said, because of that perspective, because of that, you know, outsider within perspective, I'm actually always struck by how US-centric we still are. So coming now as somebody who I had lived abroad before, et cetera, you know, but now really my home is somewhere else. But I'm coming back to what had been my home. And man, our cultural references are, you know, we're assuming a US audience. We're assuming US legal frameworks. We're assuming US consciousness of what is appropriate action, right? Folks, we are one of 219 countries now. Pardon me?
193.
193? Are we counting South Sudan? We are? Okay, are we counting Tibet? No, okay. So you know, like, you know, we're counting Palestine. You know, I mean, this is very important, you know. So you know, but we're one of many. And yes, you know, and again, I am a person who was born and raised in this grandiosity. But it's really jarring now that I live a little bit more in the periphery to see how we still have it. We human rights activists, we human rights scholars, we those who are pushing narratives, who are involved in critical thinking, we have to remember that we are one of many. And that humility can be really important, but that also our assumptions in terms of our audience will exclude our audience, right? So I just want to say that we can't just fly in the foreign speakers and parade them around. You know, we also have to remember that we need to be learning, listening, and including in who we assume are here. So that's just one thing I just really want to say, and that I'm lucky that I actually can now see it in a way that I don't think I was capable of seeing it before. I have a whole lot of other things to say, but I'm going to leave it at that.
I see it.
Thank you.
Yes, and in part because I have been straddling both the U.S. and the Arab region for the last 45, 50 years, really, since we immigrated to the U.S. in the 60s, and then I made my way back to the region. So I fully agree with what Shayna was saying, but I wanted to add just a couple of notes to that. And one is, in thinking about human rights issues within the U.S., the tendency on the part of activists and academics is to go to the Constitution. Mm-hmm. It is not to go to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example, which the US has signed and ratified, mm-hmm. and to which it can be committed. There is not a tendency to, I mean, it's happening more now, but it didn't used to happen, that a lot of, you know, other than the international organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, that would actually present a shadow report to the Human Rights Committee on U.S. practices vis-a-vis these rights. You know, but also, what about advocacy for the U.S. to ratify the Child Rights Convention, which has not yet done?
102.
Yeah. What about the advocacy to ratify and this is crucial in today's age, especially when we're talking about income disparities and inequalities, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Because most American lawyers don't think economic rights and social rights are rights. And why not engage this debate right now? And that will bring American society, US society, into the international debates on human rights, and it begins that process of educating society that we are here part of a global construct called human rights that is designed to help us improve the situation.
I'd like to just pick up on this, because one thing that I'm learning in my local work in Pittsburgh, is that academics can play a really important role in expanding the conversations in our communities to include references to international conventions. And just for instance, in Pittsburgh, one of the things that we're talking with among local activists about is the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is one of the few treaties, human rights treaties, that the U.S. has ratified. And so there's a review process. And there's some really amazing, excellent documents that we can use. The Civil Society Shadow Report on the latest review, and the report of the committee on U.S. Compliance or non-compliance with the treaty. And that's a really excellent tool for local organizing. And it's amazing how people who don't really understand how the UN works, when you talk to them about this treaty, especially African Americans in Pittsburgh, they really are excited that somebody in Geneva cares about my experiences of racism in this city, where the mayor really doesn't care that we're being pushed out of the city. So that's been really helpful. We also, there's a really excellent example of the use of the Convention Against Torture, which is another treaty that the U.S. is a party to, and it was used to put pressure on the Chicago Police Department, and really led to a settlement of a case of torture in the Chicago Police Department. We brought the lawyer to Pittsburgh to come and meet with folks in Pittsburgh, and really, I think, inspired attention to that. So I think, we should think of our role as academics really helping create a bridge between local conversations and these global imaginaries about what human rights is when we get beyond the local and national context of discussion, which are bounded by notions of citizenship, which of course contradict human rights.
If I can say just one thing regarding Chicago, a friend and colleague of mine who was the lead editor of Praxis Center actually was very influential regarding that, Alice Kim, and one of the things that they pushed, and I think may be relevant for everybody here, is not, yes, financial settlement, yes, but also the use of the term torture, to actually have that term torture used, to stop differentiating this notion of police brutality and torture when we're talking about agents of the state, in discrimination, but then also to have curriculum in the schools. And this, I think, is really, really, really key. It's something that may be interesting to folks here, to actually recognize education as a form of activism and as a form of not only rewriting history, but perhaps actually creating possibilities for the future. And that was coming from, again, the victims, and victims as, a source of expertise and direction in this sense.
Thank you very much. So, I think we've already begun to move in this direction. I think it's where we want to go. And it's certainly something that, again, is in the mission of the Human Rights Center here, and also fundamental to why we convene this conference, and that is what we call the critical self-reflection, right? The critical self-reflection of the human rights community itself. And so I think it's appropriate at this point, again, we've sort of started already, to be critically self-reflective of our own self-reflection, to see, well, how well are we really doing that even here, It never stops. It's a loop. It's like, how well have we done that? Because again, it is one thing to talk about it, and it's quite another to do it, especially when we all get together. All we want to do is really pat ourselves on the back. And Fateh's already told the rest of us academics that what we do is useless, so he's already begun us on that path. But seriously, how do you feel about the critical nature of the content this week? We certainly received some feedback through the post-its, which we appreciate, which is definitely informing our conversation today, that there's even a certain kind of taken for granted nature of the human rights framework itself, and there's reason for that, and maybe we can talk about that, but isn't that some some baseline for the beginning of that self-reflection, is to investigate the utility of human rights in certain areas, and investigate its disutility. Like where is it causing more harm than good? Where is it distracting from other kinds of calls for justice and equality or fairness? We've also had some conversations, as well as a post-it around how do you talk about economic rights without talking about a more thorough critique of capitalism, for instance, right? And that's another tension within human rights, that it sort of props up property rights at the expense of a more thorough critique of capitalism itself. And so maybe we can start with that. I mean, and before this devolves into a negative spiral, well, at least just say that, where are there areas where you would have liked to have seen more critique, or there are rooms for us to sort of explore those more critical spaces? Let's start. Yeah, sure. Open it up. Yeah. We'll do Abby first, but we saw their hands also.
Is this on? Yeah. I guess I work with people in transit, and I use that word strategically and deliberately, but sort of this false distinction between refugees and migrants, which is so problematic because it leaves people out of rights. And so I know that's a citizenship-based framework of rights, but we're calling it human rights, that refugees need access to protection, but it leaves out, millions of people. So I have a question mark around that. And I think the other thing along those same lines is thinking about mobility instead of borders, and I talked about this in my presentation, but every time we talk about the border, I feel like we get stuck there and we forget about the people that are moving across those borders. So I guess those are two things from my perspective, my research, that need to be really considered. If we're using a human rights framework, does it fit, and how can we expand it to really fit the lived experiences of those people in transit?
Hi, everyone. I'll try to say this as eloquently as I can here. Something that this is my first time to the conference, and it's just been so amazing to be around these great minds, and I really appreciate all the work that you guys do. Something that I would have liked to hear more about, because I think it's so relevant, is the power of technology across these borders for migrants, refugees, people in transit. I think that we can't leave that out of the conversation, because it's so a part of our lives now, but what are the greatest platforms to use for human rights activists and researchers to get our narratives out, and just how does that play into? I just like to hear responses to that, because one person in our panel kind of talked about, I don't know where he is, but talked about, yes, great, how there are these signal territories that have now been created that are subnational, that aren't, they're non-states, and yet we're creating these new territories with technology, and what does that mean for refugees today?
Hi, my name is Christy Kenyon. I'm at the University of Winnipeg. And I guess I want to first of all say that I don't think patting ourselves on the back is inherently a bad thing, provided we don't stop there. That education is a revolutionary act, and I think we are all a part of that in some way. That said, I do think, and I think I said this is my third time here, so I'm very, very grateful to have been involved over a long time period. To me, a glaring gap is Indigenous rights. I think those really need to be higher priority than they are. And perhaps tied with that I do actually think it's entirely appropriate as human rights practitioners and scholars to engage with and critique the limitations of human rights as a concept. I mean, it was fascinating to me in teaching a somewhat conventional constitutional approach to human rights when my students put their hands up and said, well, what about that river in New Zealand that has rights? Can we do that here? And I was like, well, it would be very difficult, but that's an excellent question. Let's look at the things that limit us in this structure. But also, just building on the last question, so all those aspects of structure, the concept of human rights and the limitations and potentials of it, but also the source of authority, that I agree with the conversation that just happened about making that link to international conventions is really important. But also thinking beyond that and thinking beyond the state structure, local to local would be a place I'd like to see a lot more around if groups are mobilizing in the US or in the Americas, and groups in other parts of the world, in Africa or in Europe, are working on similar issues, what kind of knowledge sharing, and ideally dual direction knowledge sharing, can we have? How can local learn from local? So that's also something that I would love to see explored a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Natalie Hudson from the University of Dayton. I think when I think about what it means to be critical of actually being critical, it's like, okay, so when were those moments that I was uncomfortable in the last couple of days? Because those would be the moments where we were approaching that. And then I had a few of those. I had a moment when Roxana, not this Roxanne, Roxana on the peace panel talked about the attention that Columbia is getting, including at this conference, and how problematic that was for her. In fact, that meant in terms of how that may or may not contribute to more violence in the region. There was also a moment with our speaker yesterday afternoon, Nadiezda, probably butchering that a little bit, but when she was asked, well, what can we do? And she said, worry about what's going on in your own country and figure that out first. And that was a moment. And even discussions about capitalism yesterday at the afternoon panel was a moment of like, ooh, this is a little uncomfortable. And I think welcoming those, embracing those moments is part of it. So thank you.
I want to pick up on that. I mean, Joel, you were present at the creation and framed this idea of social practice and constructive critique. I agree with Natalie. There were those moments, but I have to say, this being the third, I'm thinking back to the last one. I think last time there were a lot of, I may be overstating this, some cheap shots at almost like people had to come up and say something critical about human rights activism or U.S. foreign policy or something like that. I feel less of that here. I heard a really positive agenda coming out, a wide range of research. I think Fateh laid this out, really positive things to go, cognizant of some of the issues we have to bring up. I make a comment about framing things in terms of CERD and tying this up to Carol last night. If we framed issues in terms of the Convention on Racial Discrimination, Charlottesville would have never happened. We would have to criminalize and outlaw groups that do that, but we attached a reservation to that. So that would be a very interesting thing. So this focus on the United States, critique of the United States, I thought was a lot sharper, almost gratuitous last time. Capitalism, I always cringe at that one because you'll remember this entire conference now in its third iteration was and is made possible by a gift from a corporate executive. The university wasn't going to put up that money. So I mean, I always sort of cringe on that one a little bit. But I think, just to finish, that where this conference has come from when we first conceptualized it, what do we hope it would be, and then to see so many people coming back and seeing the agenda advance so much, it's just encouraging. I mean, that's self-serving because I'm at the university, but it's been wonderful to have so many of you come back so many times and assist us. I have to say, and this will be the final point, our thinking about the Human Rights Center, I think, and this is my own impression, your contributions not only affirmed our original concept, working at the frontiers of research and advocacy, but you've pushed the frontier for us. So I just wanted to make those general comments.
Roxanne. And Carol. Carol.
Hi, everyone. It's been a real pleasure to be here. I think what I appreciate is this is a group that doesn't step back from the things that make you cringe. And that, to me, is at the essence of human rights practice. I think for me, a dilemma of self-reflection, as Joel put it, and also a sense of how do I move forward in my own work in embodying it, is let's not take the social practice of human rights to mean that we just gaze at vulnerability, but also at the production of it. Right? Let's not study victims per se exclusively, but the production of victimhood through violence and through bureaucracy. And I loved your point in the opening panel on the production of violence, the production of forced displacement, as opposed to just the reception of it. And I think if we're asking ourselves, what can researchers do, for example, part of it is let's orient our gaze towards power, not just towards vulnerability, not one at the exclusion of the other. But it's an orientation towards power that I'll be taking away. Thank you all.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conference, and I really liked that race came up a lot. I think it's an appropriate year that be a central theme. I was surprised climate change didn't come up more, and I would love to see at least one full plenary directly on climate change. I know it came up in some of the breakout groups, but I think it's huge and it impacts all of the other human rights issues, particularly race, considering that the people who least produced climate change will be dying in mass numbers in the developing world.
Hi, my name is Christine Bianco. I'm from Florida International University. And one of the things that I've been thinking about sitting here is how much perhaps we focus on things that are immediate. With the Columbia speech, how many people are focusing on Columbia now, both research-wise, and this is, I think, a fault of academics and probably also activists, is that we focus on the things that are hot-button issues because perhaps because they're more prevalent, perhaps because we see them more, but also probably a little bit because if other people see them more, we can make more progress in them. But that leaves a lot. There are also a lot of things that are going on that aren't as hot button that we can't do as quickly. And maybe we need to slow down sometimes and take a look at these things that aren't seen. And side note, there are 3 states now that haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Since Sudan became a state, it also hasn't ratified it.
That's right. South Sudan. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Barbara. I'm from Slovenia. I would just like to say something about how I understand critique of human rights. I think when we reflect on the human rights regime, we have to think beyond that, kind of what are the other ideologies that are reproduced by our promotion of human rights. We have to be aware that this is just one of a kind of political ideologies along with another ones. We also have to be aware that the rights that are now listed as human rights were not human rights from the start. They were actually enacted by other kind of ideologies. For example, right to education, before it became human right, was used for a capitalist interest, for a nationalist interest, and so on. So I think to be critical of human rights means to see how human rights are used in order to reproduce our political world. Kind of, why do we have a right to self-determination? This is a human right, but it actually is used to reproduce nation state, and nation state is kind of a base also for exclusion. So it's kind of, we have to problematize all this kind of viewpoints that may not come together so easily, but do combine within human rights framework.
Hi, how are you? I've really enjoyed the conference, so it's mainly positive. But one of the things I would have liked to see more of, seen is we're talking about research here, it's different approaches to research. Because, if you're going to critique even human rights in general, we have to critique how we approach researching human rights. And I think I mentioned this in my panel, if you were there, about a term that I heard from a Zimbabwean academic, which was the term epistemicide, which is the genocide of epistemological outlooks that are not Eurocentric, they're not, US-centric or Northern-centric. And it's really something that I've struggled with because, being in a Northern university, you do have to fit certain norms. But if you're going to talk about the rights of Indigenous people or the rights of minorities or people in the Global South, then you have to talk about how you approach even studying and researching these rights.
My name is Lena. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs, and I'm at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. So one emergent theme tying some of these threads is how do we think in the long term about how to do the best version of human rights work in ways that don't reinscribe oppression in slightly different forms? How do we not accidentally shut the door behind ourselves once we get through the door? And how do we craft narratives that are intentional in the ultimate goal of liberation, where my freedom is not coming at the expense of someone else's freedom? So that's been on my mind the last few days, particularly, and I'll keep this intentionally vague, that there was a paper, and in response to a paper, someone asked, pretty upfront, aren't you concerned that this shift in framework will come at the expense of increased incarceration of Black men in the United States? And the response to that from a person who was white was, yeah, I think it will. But was not open to critique about how that narrative was going to be doing harm, and was not even ignorant to that, had just accepted that that was going to be the cost of this shift in framework that they were proposing. And so thinking about how we craft narrative in intentional ways, and thinking about how do we do critique and also create more space for creation. Because a lot of the time we're like, this is the problem, we need to identify the problem, we need to identify solutions, but the solutions comes after. And imagining a different way of being and creating new possibilities is something that we sometimes don't have the mental space or time to do because we're playing catch up to the immediate issues. So I'd love to see in the future, what are ways that we can imagine and create new possibilities?
That's excellent. Thank you all. Archana, would you like to replies? Oh, please, of course, Jackie. Yeah.
I had a few more observations about kind of critiques or what we might do better. And I've worked with the National Human Rights Cities Alliance, which is part of the U.S. Human Rights Network. And there's a very different framing of human rights in that organization. And because it is grassroots and largely people of color led organization, and they frame their view as a people-centered human rights. And it's, I think, instructive for us to look at that approach and the language that we're using to think about, we're developing a statement of principles for human rights cities based on this people-centered human rights, and it's the idea of decolonizing our thinking and recognizing the Eurocentrism of human rights discourse and the legal framework, but also understanding that human rights preceded states. We've come to understand them within the framework of states, but they're really the result of struggles that are, as old as human history and continuing. And so they're constantly being transformed through struggle. And so this is the understanding that our group brings, along with, not taking for granted the idea that capitalism is the framework that we're going to be working in. And saying there is an alternative to capitalism, and there must be if we're going to have human rights. And even the idea of states has to be deconstructed. So I think what we might maybe think more about is what role can scholars and activists in the human rights movement play in expanding the political imaginaries, so that we can get beyond this idea that there isn't any alternative to the way we've got things organized, and we just got to figure out how to regulate capital better, rather than thinking about how can we restructure our economic and social relations around human rights, starting with human rights. So such a few thoughts.
There's a lot here, and I actually kind of like the way things came full circle. I'm going to tell a story for a second. Can we do story time for just 1 second? Yeah, okay. So it actually is a story that took place here in Yellow Springs, Ohio. I did my undergrad at Antioch College, which explains a lot. But anyways, But it was really interesting because it was around 1996, 1997, and there was this sounds terrible. I'm going to say this. There was a bombing going on in Iraq. And there was, and some, it was my first year of undergrad, and my classmates were, protesting, and somehow we actually got the attention of the Dayton newspapers, as well as like the Springfield newspapers, more conservative papers. And, I come from a journalistic background from way back in the day, so I know how hard it is to get the attention of these more conservative newspapers in some pretty military-heavy towns, right? We're going to talk about Wright-Patterson right there, et cetera, et cetera. Journalists came, interviewed, my classmates, and was like, what's going on? And my classmates, and, we're just like, this is what's wrong, and this is what's wrong, and this is what's wrong, and this is what's wrong. And the journalist's like, okay, so what would you do? What would you suggest? silence. Silence. And as somebody with a journalistic background, I put my head in my hand and went, pardon me, I won't say that word. Okay. Oh, defecation. You know, like, this is bad because you have just lost a really amazing possibility and allyship and voice and avenue here. And that actually hit framed. That thing that happened when I was 18 years old framed my entire academic pursuit of why is it so easy to say what's wrong and so difficult and challenging to say what can be. Like that switched it right there. Why? And why? And then what do we need? What can we do so that it can be more possible to imagine what could be possible? And going back to this notion of having, indigenous perspectives, not just in terms of what is wrong in terms of, what is happening within, to indigenous peoples, to the first peoples of a land, but also what are other possibilities of seeing human rights beyond a state framework, right? What are other possibilities of seeing human rights beyond even an anthropomorphic framework? What are other ways of seeing human rights when you're actually looking at them in terms of generations before, now, and in the future, and actually seeing it and different epistemological possibilities as well as doing, not separating method and content. Not evaluating on the base of something that can be aggregated, but truly understanding what we can learn from a holistic understanding, and again, not fetishizing it, but a holistic understanding of what rights can be. And so that's one thing. The other thing I just would say that I would really hope that we can see, and that I really would hope we could see more of, is that we are human rights actors, and we are active in this world in a variety of frames, and there are consequences because of that. So I'm not doing this in self-grandizing, and I'm really, really, really not, but I wrote a piece called The Dangers of Drinking Coffee Alone, in terms of how so many of us who are involved in human rights activism in a variety of ways, and human rights work in a variety of ways, funders, academics, activists, et cetera, all the above, and how yet we spend so much of our time alone. And that this is really, this can be really problematic, and this can make us really sick and also a little bit limited in terms of what we can do. And I'd really love to be able to see sessions about human rights work and what does that work actually look like. I promise I'm going to be quiet now. I'm sorry.
Yeah. You're welcome to come over for coffee anytime.
Yeah? Awesome. I have an awesome Finjan too.
Yeah, great.
There we go.
I just had a couple of cautionary thoughts, I guess, in the context of self-critique and hearing a lot of and I don't disagree with anything that's being said, but it makes me worry a little bit sometimes that, yes, everything is interconnected and everything affects everything else. We all affect each other all the time. If we worry too much, we risk paralysis, seems to me. So in the end, we have to put our best foot forward and try and go in as deep as possible in terms of our analysis and our scenario building, if you will. If I adopt this kind of approach and this kind of position, how is that going to affect? How is that is going to increase incarceration? All of this work. You have to, at some point, make a decision and move forward. So one cautionary note is, let's not get paralyzed by worries. And especially by worries in terms of, in my mind, and this is a tough one to say, I hate to say it, but it is there. The worry about political correctness of things, making sure that you use the right term, Global South and people of color. I mean, that's all important and it's good, but it risks paralysis. It risks your isolating yourself. I'd rather drink coffee alone rather than sit there and fight with somebody over whether I want to put milk in it or not.
No, you can't actually say that. You might offend.
Oh, no, sorry. I just did. I just said it. So in a way, I mean, that's one area of cautionary worry that I have behind all of that. And the second one is not to burden human rights as a paradigm, as a field, with more than it can bear. In the sense of what? Yes, it can be anything to anybody and everything to everybody. But in the final analysis, as a system, in my mind, the unique contribution that the human rights paradigm has added to the world is that you've got, as I was saying earlier, you've got moral principles that have been politically agreed in specific texts in treaties that become legal obligations on the part of states. That's the unique contribution. Now we can take the moral concepts of that in terms of education, in terms of analysis, in terms of the broader views, the anthropological views and the sociological views and the international relations views. We can take the politics of it. We can take the legal analysis of it. And God knows, the analyses of the legal texts of human rights have been done ad nauseum to the degree that people have accused lawyers of hijacking human rights, for example. But in the end, let's not expect more of what this paradigm is, and let's see how it relates to all other paradigms and make sure that, okay, we cannot do that at the expense of this. I say this why? Because, when you realize that the international community of states have intentionally set up the human rights system so that any enforcement mechanism is fundamentally a political decision. It's very easy to then jump and say, well, this whole thing of human rights is just a tool in the hands of the powerful against the powerless, and why is the ICC only bringing out people from Africa for investigation? And you start making these kinds of conclusions, expecting more of human rights than what they can deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, one suggestion would be, particularly on the notion of political correctness, is that we can do both, that we can sort of be respectful of people and places and identities and positions while also being sort of progressive and, have a positive political agenda, and so the concern is not that it's a trade-off of being, political correctness for, therefore leads to paralysis, but that in fact it's possible to do both, and it makes us better off to do both. Is a suggestion.
To be aware of the potential for paralysis.
Sure.
That's really all.
Sure.
And also to be open to learn, though, to be like, oh, wow, okay, I understand how that word could be that way. Thank you, and then so it's not that of offensive, but a sense of learning,
recognition, learning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've only got about 10 more minutes or so. So kind of picking up on those last themes, we want to finish off the conversation with a little bit of what we asked in those sticky notes yesterday in terms of what are some things or what is something that you're taking away that brings you hope from the conversations that you've had in the last few days. And that could be in terms of strategies for collaboration, for how you could do things differently, or what you might be thinking of differently in any kind of, however you want to interpret that in the broadest sense.
Can we start with the audience?
Yeah.
What's something that gives you hope, something that you're leaving with that you didn't come with?
Hi, my name is Doug Janoff. I'm with the Foreign Ministry in Ottawa, and I'm also doing research on global LGBT diplomacy. And I've really enjoyed this conference. I haven't been able to attend a lot of the sessions, but I guess the thing that gives me hope here is the critical self-reflection of Americans talking about human rights in this sort of environment. I am also from the periphery observing this conversation in some ways, and it really gives us a lot of hope. And in fact, I was trying to explain to a Canadian friend of mine before I came here this conference and what it was going to be like, and he said, "You mean there are progressive people in the United States who care about human rights?" And I said, "Yeah, like probably at least 50% of the population, and he was just stunned by that. So that's what gives me hope. And maybe one thing I wanted to just throw out as a challenge in my is maybe to Americans to maybe talk about sort of the power that you have in terms of prioritizing certain human rights issues and bringing them to the fore. And I thought about this because I'm doing research with diplomats and the dialogue between diplomats and civil society organizations on LGBT rights. And this question came up because I said, why is it that, there's some really horrible things happening to LGBT people around the world, and I did a presentation this morning on a little bit on Chechnya. What is it that we can't prioritize here? Why is it that all human rights are human rights and, we have to treat everyone differently, and we can't acknowledge that there are certain countries where people are actually being tortured in prisons right now, and why don't we just drop all our tools and focus on that? Would that be so bad? And the observation that I had made in my research was that it was all about African LGBT rights, and there was no discussion about all the killings going on of trans people in Central America. And this human rights advocate explained to me that, she went to a meeting with a very important U.S. donor who was going to give them funding to, and they suggested a program to support the mass assassination of trans people in Central America, and they were told that this wouldn't fit into their paradigm because this is part of generalized violence in Central America, which is an endemic problem. And so, therefore, this foundation wasn't able to really, highlight the work that they were doing in LGBT, so they ended up going to another country where it was, they had the programming, but the issue wasn't as acute. So I guess I'm wondering if it's politically incorrect or if it's even possible in future conferences to maybe focus on certain critical areas and to maybe brainstorm around that. Thanks.
Thank you. Alexander?
So I just want to share a little something from I think a student's perspective. And one thing that Dr. Hudson invited Roxanne to talk to our class yesterday. And something big that I took away from it and I've kind of pulled out of some discussions here is optimism throughout many of these issues that we deal with. And almost the necessity for optimism, especially as a student. Many of us are getting ready to go into this work. We're just on the cusp of branching out. And I think if there was no optimism present and if we were burdened very heavily emotionally by some of these things that we're wrestling with, many of us would not have the motivation to go on and to pursue fighting for some of these issues. So not to diminish the issues themselves, but to instead say that optimism can be a good thing in this work. And that's something I've taken away and I think is hopeful for me, knowing that I can be optimistic, but also realistic about the things that we will wrestle with. So just wanted to share that.
Other thoughts or hands?
There's Tony, I think, right?
Yeah. And
back there, sorry.
Great. I didn't want to be last, so that's good. I just wanted to talk about, I think the one thing that really struck me was the fact that everyone else here, it seems, really recognizes how important that we all live in silos and how important it is to tear down all those silos if we really want to get something done. And there was also equally a recognition of how difficult that is to actually accomplish. We all talk about tearing them down all the time, but then we retreat back to our silos talk amongst ourselves about how important it is to tear down our silos. So I'm just really happy that a lot of other people have grasped that as well and are very eager to do it.
My name is Father Ted Cassidy. I'm here at the university, sort of retired and doing spiritual direction, and I'm taking a course on spiritual direction. And as we talked, I keep thinking of some of the processes of finding how God operates in our lives. For example, you take St. Ignatius, who says you keep looking for consolation or desolation. You take John of the Cross, who says we go through the dark nights. Or Chaminade, our founder, who says you have to really search for deep humility and also deep identity. And I think behind all of this search that we're doing for human rights, it requires a deep consciousness of this struggle that we go through and these processes that the great spiritual leaders have shown us to. I'm sure other religions have the same ones. And I think that's kind of behind it all. And we're going through this process, and God is leading us someplace, and we keep struggling and struggling to know it. But from what I get from the conferences, we are doing an awful lot of good, and we're finding it. So I just want to say that.
Perhaps some reflections from all of you. Anything to add? Something hopeful that you're taking away?
I don't know if this is hopeful, but a reflection on the work that we have ahead and thinking about the role of the university in society. And I think we in the academy should be thinking more about how we can change our institutions so that we can be more active and conscious participants in the human rights movement rather than trying to figure out how to make it work within the rubrics of our professional norms and practices, and really say that, you know, we can't pretend to be neutral in this world, and we have to take a side for human rights and really put our resources and energies into being part of the work to change the world and being very conscious and unapologetic about doing that.
I mean, one thing that I would say is first of all, yes, optimism. Like really? Yes, and humor. Okay, I used to work at a torture treatment center. You got the best humor from the torture treatment center, from the people who are victims, quote unquote, right? Because there is hope, because there is passion, because there is survivors, because there is a next, and there is that possibility, right? And so humor and hope and optimism are absolutely not just needed, but are the fire that keeps us all going. And one thing that I would say, I look around, and especially because this is my third time here, and I do truly feel like I have friends, compañeros, compañeras, and also like just possibilities of what's going on and what's going to be looking forward in that way, because we are the engine, but not just the people who are in this room, but the people who aren't in this room, but that we know, and and that's what it is. And I think that it really leads me to the notion of Praxis and not just Praxis Center. Yes, everybody, please, contact me if you want to work for Praxis Center, and write a piece. We don't pay you anything. But the thing is the notion of Praxis Center is for activists, academics, and artists, and people who identify as all three. And I think that if we actually look in terms of going forward, it's recognizing that we have people here who are unapologetically all three. And that's awesome. That's so much power and possibility. Like, that makes me happy, and that makes me really hopeful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shayna. I would add that some of the best humor in Palestine and Egypt comes from prison, detainees. And if you've been in prison, I mean, the humor that comes out of that is just unbelievable. I don't have a lot to add. If you're involved in human rights work, you are by definition an optimist. Because frankly, the success stories are really not that frequent. They do happen, but they're not that frequent. And oftentimes when you're talking to human rights actors and activists, say, well, what have human rights? Well, look at how much progress we've done in the last 50 years. We have so many more treaties now than we used to. Right. So, but the human rights movement keeps growing. It keeps growing, it keeps moving. I remember just 6-7 years ago talking with colleagues in the US who were struggling to get the words human rights into parlance in the US. It just wasn't there. Now look at all of you. Look at all of us, right? And I remember very well that, I mean, or I would say this is the last thing, is that not only is there a human rights movement out there, but it's a strong movement. And it cuts across language, it cuts across barriers, and we're all speaking the same language. And I first felt that in 1993 when I attended the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, right? And at that time, I was working as a Palestinian human rights activist. And we thought that nobody in the world could possibly suffer as much as we do under military occupation, you know, and we have our list and our litany of abuses and all of that. And then not only was I flabbergasted to see every language and nationality under the sun talking about what they are dealing with, but that we were all speaking the same language, regardless of what language we spoke. To me, that's amazing. And that has continually been my source of optimism. And I think that's what I would leave with.
Joel, did you want to add?
No.
Well, we're just about time, and I'd like to end by saying the thing that brings me hope is that we actually have a space like this where we're starting to bridge and bring together academics, practitioners, activists, all in one, people who do all of that in one and some of that and all of that. So we're a space on Open Global Rights where we want to do that online. And I want to say that these conversations, we hope we know they're not going to end here, and we want to bring them to the people who couldn't be here and continue the dialogue, because none of these issues, the big issues that we're all working on and thinking about, are going to end anytime soon, and we need to bring in more voices, and we need to keep thinking critically, and we're hoping to take some of the stuff that we've all been really grappling with here and continue it online and in other spaces from other spaces together, but not kind of walk away and say that's it. And so I welcome you guys to consider how you might take some of these ideas and share them either on our platform or other platform and continue the conversation. So I think that's it. Well, thank you very, very much for sticking around and for reflecting with us.
Yay.
Yusuf gets the last word always.
I'm a little bit emotional right now because this is over. And then comes the difficult part, what's next, right? It's important for all of us to hold each other accountable for the work that we do. And I know many times we all go into our silos, but let's make sure that there's someone who knocks on our door and, you know, hey, I remember you from that conference that took a year of planning and a lot of work. And, you know, what's going on? You know, what can we do? Really, it's been a great 3 days meeting all of you, and I've met all three generations of SPHR. So however we can be there for each other, I think UD is a place for that. Whether you feel like there are necessary additional conventions, whether in person or virtually, that we can work on, UD is a place for you to come and find that getaway. One of the things I think Carol said earlier today, she said, you bring us here, you put us here, you nowhere anything around us, and it's great time to reflect. It's like a workshop. You force us to think, you force us to do reflections. I'd be more than happy to do that again and again and again and again if it produces more of these conversations. So I really want to thank you. If you are writing anything or after the conference or whatnot, please get in touch with me. There will be post-conference conversations, and I'm looking at everybody who is responsible, so we can definitely make sure that happens. We will be in touch. If you have any questions, let us know. I really, really want to thank everyone who helped me. This did not happen just like that. And particularly Maggie, Vanessa, Bradley, and Chase, and Gaba. You've been great, and yeah, thank you.